Hey guys, Mr. Nichols here to kind of talk to you guys about what we're going to be doing today. So today we're going to be applying some of the things that we've learned about the 7S's of how to process a crime scene and just overall crime scene investigation so far this semester, and applying them to one of the most famous murder trials of all time, and that is the murder trial of O.J. Simpson. So while we're going through and watching this here today, I'd like you guys to please set aside anything you might previously think that you know about this case here, and we want to look at it strictly through the lens of what we've learned so far this semester and really the sanctity of the evidence that is going to be presented to us here. So again, just make sure that we're kind of following along, and then periodically as we're watching this video, we're going to pause it. I'm going to kind of summarize some thoughts that we should be kind of keying in on and connecting it back to what we've done so far this semester. So let's go ahead and get started. So if we look here, the detective was able to look at the evidence at the crime scene and be able to piece together what they thought happened. So remember, this is just like what we did in the murder of Mr. Kelly activity, where we were using the evidence that we had to try and create a narrative. So here the detective was able to just look at those footprints and be able to determine approximately what that suspect did in that short period of time, just by looking at their gait or how they walked, seeing if one of the footprints was angled back out. Maybe that suspect went and turned and looked back at the crime scene. So just using some simple evidence, he was able to start to create that narrative. All right, so let's try and unpack some of that here. So obviously taking Mr. Simpson into custody and questioning him about his whereabouts that evening is going to be a big part of this case. So some of the things that he did that were really suspicious at the time for the investigators was that when he was trying to explain how he got the cut on his hand, he was really inconsistent in his explanation. He kind of changed his story, didn't really have a solid explanation for why he had that cut on his hand. So the other piece that kind of elevated investigators' suspicion of Mr. Simpson was the testimony of the limo driver. So the limo driver pulled up to Mr. Simpson's house at around 10:25, didn't see anyone there, didn't see the Ford Bronco, and then he left, he came back, and then he came back just before 11 o'clock, and he saw that the Ford Bronco had returned and that an African-American male was walking up the driveway. So the investigators believe that the murder took place at about 10:30. So this means that the alibi of Mr. Simpson does not line up with the proper timeline established by that limo driver. So this inevitably led Mr. Simpson to become the prime suspect in this investigation. All right, so here we are talking about one of the strongest pieces of evidence that the prosecution thought that they had for identifying Mr. Simpson and connecting him to the crime scene. So if we remember, the blood that was found that was on the trail that was leaving the crime scene was found to be most likely Mr. Simpson's, and the likelihood that it was someone else's was about 1 in 170 million. So very likely to be Mr. Simpson's. And the blood on the back gate was even higher. It was 1 in several billion. So if we think about this here, this should be very strong evidence for the prosecution here. But as we'll find out here in a little bit, that blood on the back gate will be particularly important here. Now, one thing that I do want to mention, some of those processes that they just talked about, PCR, for example, polymerase chain reaction, is actually something that we will physically be doing in the classroom. So we will have some DNA that we collect from a crime scene, and we will run it through PCR, and we will be able to get those DNA bands that we saw in the documentary here. So that's something really exciting that we'll get to here in a little bit. So let's return to the video here. All right, So this is a great example of how we need to make sure that whenever we're collecting biological evidence, that it always is collected properly, because we don't want the DNA to be degraded and eventually thrown out of a court case. So if we think about this here, the things that were done incorrectly. So the blood, which obviously has DNA inside of it, was collected and then it was not dried. So it was packaged wet. That's going to help contamination take place. So we always need to make sure that our biological evidence is dried. Then it was placed in a plastic bag. So as we all know, biological evidence needs to be stored in a paper container so that airflow can move in and out. If it doesn't, then we can get bacteria that grows inside of there. Think about any time that if you have like a sandwich or something like that in a Ziploc bag and you leave it out on a sunny day, there's going to be condensation or moisture that collects from the inside of there. So that is going to make it very easy for bacteria to infect that sample. Okay. So, and then also they went in, not only did they do those things, but they also threw it in the back of a van on a hot California day and just it baked in there for hours. So the defense team was able to use this as a way to throw out that evidence because they assumed it was contaminated. All right, so that was kind of a lot. So let's go ahead and unpack that here. So first things first, talking about the blood spatter on the socks. So the defense team made the argument that the droplets that were on there were not in fact spatter. And the forensic scientists that testified about that basically said that it would be impossible for that blood spatter to pass through the sock if there was a foot in it, which, as the prosecution suggested, that if Mr. Simpson was wearing those socks at the time of the murder, his foot would have been in the socks. So the blood wouldn't have been able to soak through all of those surfaces. And then in addition to that, the spatter was not light and speckled. It was very thick and large droplets. So then the other piece that we also talked about here was the EDTA. So EDTA is a preservative that is used in many labs to try and make it so that the blood does not degrade over time, so it can be preserved. Now, EDTA is actually present in your bloodstream normally, but more concentrated EDTA is going to prevent that blood from being decomposed or degrading. So the fact that the blood on the back gate was not as degraded as the blood that was collected at the crime scene right after the evidence, or right after the murder took place, is very suspicious. And not only that, but the blood that was also found on the gate and on the socks had exceedingly high levels of EDTA. So this led the defense to capitalize and say that it was planted there after it was already stored inside of the evidence, or stored inside of the crime lab, I should say. Okay, so let's go ahead and continue. All right, so now that we've gone through and learned a lot more about kind of the backstory of what actually happened in this case, I'd like you guys to now take a look at all of the evidence that we just went through and ask yourself, do you think that Mr. Simpson committed this crime beyond a reasonable doubt? So when we're talking about reasonable doubt, as we can see with this little diagram here, so basically reasonable doubt is essentially, that means that the evidence is going to outweigh any uncertainty that you have that that person did not commit that crime. So a reasonable doubt means that it's a logical conclusion that that person did not commit that crime. So what that means is that the evidence has to push beyond that reasonable doubt. That needs to push your suspicion past where you have any level of uncertainty that that person committed a crime. Now, when we think about that here, we also need to keep in mind that, if someone is prosecuted for this crime or some of these other very serious crimes, you're potentially taking away decades of their life or potentially their entire lives. So it's really important that we have that evidence and that it's strong enough to push beyond our own individual reasonable doubts if we were a juror sitting on one of these cases. So I hope that you guys enjoyed this video here today. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out, and we'll see you guys soon. So take care, everybody. Have a great day.